October 24th, 1942, 2:47 a.m., Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air hung thick with the smell of cordite and rotting vegetation. In the darkness, beneath a canopy woven from palm fronds and camouflage netting, a lone Marine pressed his cheek against the worn walnut stock of his Springfield M1903. The rifle's metal was cold despite the tropical heat. Mitchell Page, a 24-year-old platoon sergeant from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, lay in a shallow fighting hole carved from volcanic soil, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of jungle 50 yards distant. The night was never truly silent on Guadalcanal. Tree frogs chirped in mad choruses, fruit bats swooped overhead, the jungle breathed. But beneath those sounds, Page heard something else. The rustle of equipment, the snap of a twig, the whispered commands in a language he didn't understand but had come to recognize. Japanese behind him, Henderson Field stretched across the coastal plain like a scar of civilization carved into the wilderness. Its single runway, little more than compacted coral and dirt, represented the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific Theater. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the skies over the southern Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled the Southern Solomons controlled the sea lanes to Australia, and whoever controlled those sea lanes would determine whether the Empire of Japan's southward expansion would continue unchecked or whether America would hold the line. Everything, the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War, pivoted on this miserable strip of jungle real estate that the Marines had seized 2 months earlier in America's first major offensive operation of the war. Mitchell Page understood none of the grand strategy. He understood only that he and 42 other men of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, held a quarter-mile stretch of defensive perimeter on a low ridgeline south of the airfield. Their orders were simple: hold the line. Do not let the Japanese reach the runway. The survival of the Marine Corps on Guadalcanal, perhaps the entire campaign, depended on men like him doing exactly that. What Page didn't know, what none of the exhausted Marines dug in along that ridge could know, was that in the jungle before them, more than 2,000 Japanese soldiers from the Sendai Division were moving into assault positions. They had been force-marched through 20 miles of jungle trails, subsisting on rice balls and water, driven forward by officers who promised them glory and honor. They had been told that the Americans were weak, that their lines would crumble under a proper banzai charge, that the runway would be theirs by dawn. The Japanese commanders had studied American psychology and found it wanting. Americans, they believed, lacked the spiritual strength, the Yamato Damashii, the warrior spirit, to withstand a determined assault. Americans fought for money and comfort, not for emperor or honor. When death came screaming at them in the darkness, the Americans would break. The Japanese were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The first probing attacks came at 3:15 a.m. Japanese infantry emerged from the tree line in small groups, testing the Marine positions, searching for weak points in the defenses. Page held his fire. His Springfield held only 5 rounds in its internal magazine, and every shot had to count. Around him, other Marines opened up with M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles, their muzzle flashes creating strobing patterns in the darkness. The Japanese fell back. Page knew this was just reconnaissance. The real attack was coming. It came at 4:10 a.m. The jungle exploded with sound. Hundreds of voices rose in a coordinated battle cry. Banzai! Tenohaika! Banzai! As wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged up the slope. They came with fixed bayonets, their rifles held at port arms, their faces twisted in expressions of fanatical determination. They believed that their collective spirit, their willingness to die for the emperor, would overwhelm the individualistic Americans who valued their own lives too highly to stand and fight. The Marine line erupted in defensive fire, machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, grenades exploded in bright orange flowers of flame. The Japanese kept coming. They clambered over their own dead, climbing a growing rampart of bodies, driven forward by officers who fired pistols at any man who hesitated. The Americans were fighting now for their lives, for their foxholes, for the inches of ground directly in front of them. The grand strategy meant nothing. Henderson Field meant nothing. There was only the next target, the next trigger pull, the next Japanese soldier emerging from the smoke and darkness. Page fired his Springfield with mechanical precision. Breathe, aim, squeeze, work the bolt, eject the brass, chamber the next round, find the next target, breathe, aim, squeeze. The Springfield was an old rifle by 1942 standards, a weapon designed before the First World War, but in the hands of a trained marksman, it remained devastatingly effective. Each .30-06 Springfield cartridge carried enough kinetic energy to drop a man at 500 yards. At 50 yards, it punched through flesh and bone as if they were paper. Page didn't miss. Years of training on the rifle range at Paris Island, hundreds of hours of practice, muscle memory drilled into him until the rifle became an extension of his body. All of it paid dividends. Now Japanese soldiers dropped, one after another, stitched through the chest or throat or head by that methodical, unhurried rifle fire. But there were too many of them. For every Japanese soldier who fell, two more took his place. The Marine positions on either side of Page began to falter. Men ran out of ammunition, machine gun barrels overheated and warped. Casualties mounted. The Japanese sensed weakness and concentrated their assault on the center of the line. Page's position. If they could break through there, they could roll up the entire defensive perimeter and reach the airfield before dawn. At 4:45 a.m., the machine gun position 30 yards to Page's left went silent. The gun crew was dead or wounded. Japanese soldiers poured through the gap. Page made a decision that, in any rational calculus, should have been suicidal. He left his fighting hole, grabbed the abandoned machine gun, a Browning M 1917, a water-cooled heavy weapon that normally required a crew of 3 to operate, and dragged it back to his position. The gun weighed 43 pounds without its tripod. Page didn't have time to set up the tripod. He didn't have time for proper cooling water. He simply braced the weapon against a log, fed in a fresh belt of ammunition, and opened fire. The Browning M 1917 fired .30-06 ammunition at a rate of 450 rounds per minute. In Page's hands, it became a scythe. He swept the gun back and forth across the Japanese assault line, cutting down men in groups, creating a barrier of bodies that even fanatical courage couldn't cross. The gun barrel began to glow cherry red in the darkness. Steam hissed from the cooling jacket. Page's hands blistered from the heat. He kept firing. When one ammunition belt ran out, he fed in another. When the gun threatened to seize from the heat, he urinated on the barrel to cool it, a trick learned from veteran machine gunners who knew that in combat, you used whatever resources were available. The Japanese couldn't understand what was happening. Their intelligence had assured them that American Marines, after weeks of fighting in the jungle, subsisting on short rations, weakened by malaria and dysentery, would collapse under a determined assault. Instead, they were running into a wall of fire that seemed to come from a full platoon of machine gunners. They didn't know that the wall of fire was one man with one gun, fighting with a desperate intensity born not from fanaticism, but from something the Japanese commanders had failed to account for. The American Marine Corps ethos that said you never abandoned your position, you never left your wounded, you held the line because the men on either side of you were depending on you to hold the line. Page's Springfield lay beside him, forgotten now, its 5-round magazine inadequate for the intensity of the engagement. The machine gun was the only thing keeping the Japanese from overrunning his position. His hands moved with automatic precision, feed the belt, adjust the traverse, squeeze the trigger, sweep the fire across the kill zone. The bodies piled higher. The Japanese assault, which had begun with such confidence, with such certainty of victory, began to waver. At 5:30 a.m., as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the jungle canopy, the Japanese committed their reserve force, a fresh battalion that had been held back for the final push. They came screaming up the hill in one massive wave, hundreds of men charging shoulder to shoulder, determined to carry the position through sheer weight of numbers. This was the decisive moment. If Page's position fell, the entire Marine line would collapse, Henderson Field would be lost. The Japanese would reclaim the airstrip, would bring in their own aircraft, would establish air superiority over the Southern Solomons. The strategic consequences would ripple across the entire Pacific theater. Page saw them coming. He saw the wall of humanity surging up the slope toward him. He saw the bayonets glinting in the pre-dawn light. He saw the faces, young men, most of them no older than himself, driven forward by duty and honor and the promise of glory. For a fraction of a second, Mitchell Page from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about holding a piece of jungle real estate. This was about proving that Americans, despite what the Japanese believed, could stand and fight, could face death without flinching, could hold the line when everything depended on holding the line. He gripped the machine gun's handles, ignored the pain from his blistered hands, and opened fire into the mass of charging soldiers. The gun hammered brass casings poured from the ejection port in a golden stream, piling up around his feet. The ammunition belt fed through the gun in a continuous snake of brass and lead. Page fired not at individual targets but at zones, sweeping the gun back and forth in overlapping fields of fire. Creating a beaten zone that nothing living could cross. Japanese soldiers fell in rows. They stumbled over their own dead. They crawled forward on hands and knees. They died within feet of Page's position, so close he could see the expressions on their faces. Shock, pain, disbelief that this was happening, that they were dying here in this miserable jungle for reasons most of them probably didn't fully understand. The machine gun barrel glowed white-hot. The cooling jacket boiled dry. The gun should have seized, should have jammed, should have failed. It didn't. Page kept firing. When the water jacket finally cracked from the heat, releasing a jet of steam, he kept firing. When the wooden handguards began to smoke and char, he kept firing. When his hands started bleeding from the burns and abrasions, he kept firing. At 6:15 a.m., with full daylight spreading across Henderson Field, the Japanese assault broke. They had suffered catastrophic casualties. More than 300 dead lay in front of Page's position alone. Hundreds more were wounded, crawling back toward the jungle, leaving blood trails in the volcanic soil. The survivors, their morale shattered, their belief in inevitable victory destroyed, melted back into the jungle. The Banzai Charge, that tactical doctrine that had worked so effectively against Chinese forces in Manchuria, that was supposed to terrify and overwhelm opponents, had failed completely against the American Marines. It had failed because of technology, yes. The Americans had more and better weapons, but it had also failed because of something the Japanese high command had fundamentally misunderstood about American soldiers. They didn't fight for an emperor or for abstract concepts of national honor. They fought for the men in the foxholes beside them. They fought because their buddies were depending on them. They fought because American military culture, for all its emphasis on individual initiative and democratic values, created a sense of mutual obligation that was just as powerful as Japanese Bushido. Just as capable of producing extraordinary acts of courage. Page slumped behind the ruined machine gun, his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood. Some of it his own, most of it not. Around him, other Marines were emerging from their fighting positions, checking on wounded comrades, redistributing ammunition, preparing for the next assault. There would be no next assault. The Japanese were finished. Their attempt to retake Henderson Field had failed. The Marines would hold Guadalcanal. What Mitchell Page had done, what he had accomplished in those brutal hours between 4:10 a.m. and 6:15 a.m. on October 24, 1942, went far beyond the tactical. Yes, he had held a critical position. Yes, he had killed or wounded hundreds of enemy soldiers. Yes, he had prevented a breakthrough that could have changed the outcome of the entire campaign. But he had also done something more subtle and more profound. He had demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, that the Japanese assessment of American fighting spirit was catastrophically wrong. Americans could and would stand their ground. They could and would absorb horrific casualties and continue fighting. They could and would defeat enemy forces that had been told they were spiritually superior, that their willingness to die made them invincible. The Japanese soldiers who survived that assault, who crawled back through the jungle to their own lines, carried with them a new understanding. The Americans were not weak. The Americans were not spiritually inferior. The Americans, despite their strange democratic culture, that emphasized individual rights over collective duty could produce warriors every bit as determined and capable as the finest products of Japanese military training. This realization, propagated through letters home, through conversations in bivouacs, through the haunted expressions of men who had faced American firepower and survived, would spread through the Japanese military over the coming months and years. It wouldn't change the fanatical resistance that Japanese forces would offer as the war progressed, but it would change the quiet, private calculations that individual soldiers made about American capabilities. The myth of inevitable Japanese victory, of spiritual superiority guaranteeing tactical success, died on that ridge at Henderson Field. It died under the sights of Mitchell Page's machine gun. The Japanese High Command's assessment of American psychology had been based on outdated observations from before the war. They had seen American culture, its emphasis on comfort, its worship of material prosperity, its celebration of individualism, and concluded that Americans were soft. They had watched Hollywood films showing Americans as pleasure-seeking and materialistic. They had read American newspapers and magazines that emphasized personal happiness over collective sacrifice. They had drawn what seemed like logical conclusions. Americans valued their own lives too highly to be effective soldiers. When faced with death, they would break. This was why banzai charges would work. This was why Japanese forces could defeat American forces of equal or greater size. This was why Japan could win the war. Henderson Field proved them wrong, not just tactically, but philosophically. American culture, it turned out, produced a different kind of warrior, not one driven by emperor worship or dreams of glorious death, but one driven by pragmatic determination and loyalty to immediate comrades. The American way of war emphasized overwhelming firepower, yes, but it also emphasized something the Japanese hadn't anticipated: individual initiative and personal responsibility. Mitchell Page hadn't held that position because an officer was standing behind him with a pistol, ready to shoot him if he retreated. He had held it because he understood that his buddies were depending on him, because the American military culture, despite its democratic informality, created bonds of horizontal loyalty every bit as strong as the vertical loyalty that bound Japanese soldiers to their emperor. The Springfield rifle that Page had carried into that battle, the weapon he had used with such devastating precision before switching to the machine gun, became a symbol in the retelling of that night. It was an old rifle, an obsolete weapon by the standards of 1942. The Japanese Type 99 Arisaka was more modern. The American M1 Garand was semi-automatic, capable of much faster rates of fire, but the Springfield in trained hands remained lethally effective. It represented American pragmatism, using what worked, regardless of whether it was new or fashionable. It represented American marksmanship culture, the emphasis on accuracy over volume of fire. It represented, in a strange way, American democracy itself. An old system, perhaps outdated in some eyes, but still capable of producing extraordinary results when wielded with skill and determination. The Japanese had brought their own symbolic weapons to that fight. The Arisaka rifles with their chrome-plated chrysanthemum seals, marking them as gifts from the emperor. The samurai swords carried by officers, connecting them to an ancient warrior tradition. The senenbari, the thousand-stitch belts sewn by mothers and sisters and wives, each stitch a prayer for protection and victory. These symbols represented a culture that valued tradition, hierarchy, and spiritual strength. They were supposed to be more powerful than American symbols. They were supposed to carry Yamato Damashi into battle and make victory inevitable. They hadn't been enough. As the sun rose fully over Henderson Field on October 24th, illuminating the carnage on the ridge, American forces began the grim work of clearing the battlefield. Bodies were collected, identified where possible, prepared for burial. Weapons were gathered and cataloged. The ground itself bore witness to the intensity of the fighting: trees stripped of bark by machine gun fire, shell craters from mortar rounds, vegetation trampled and burned. The ridge would be named in honor of the men who had held it. Easy Company's defensive position would become part of Marine Corps legend, studied at officer training schools, analyzed in tactical manuals, held up as an example of courage under fire. But Mitchell Page didn't think about legend or glory or symbols as he sat behind that ruined machine gun in the growing daylight. He thought about his dead comrades. 31 men from Easy Company had been killed in the fighting, more than two-thirds of the unit. He thought about how close they had come to being overrun, how the entire battle had balanced on the edge of catastrophe. He thought about the Japanese soldiers he had killed, the young men who had died charging up that slope in the darkness. He didn't hate them. He understood in some inarticulate way that they had been doing their duty as they understood it, fighting for their country as he was fighting for his. The war was bigger than individual soldiers. It was about systems and ideologies and visions of how the world should be organized. He and those dead Japanese soldiers were just tools, wielded by forces much larger than themselves. The Springfield rifle that lay beside him, almost forgotten in the desperate intensity of the fighting, would be cleaned and oiled and returned to service. Other Marines would carry it into other battles across the Pacific Islands: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It would kill other Japanese soldiers. It would be fired by other men who, like Page, were ordinary American civilians transformed by necessity into warriors. The rifle would survive the war, would perhaps end up in a museum somewhere, labeled and displayed behind glass as a historical artifact. But for those few hours on October 24th, 1942, it had been more than an artifact. It had been a tool wielded by a man defending not just a runway or an island, but an entire way of seeing the world. The Japanese vision, the one that had driven their soldiers up that ridge in the darkness, was built on hierarchy and sacrifice and collective identity. Individual lives mattered less than the glory of the empire. Personal desires were subordinated to the will of the emperor. This wasn't wrong exactly. It was simply different, a different way of organizing society, a different answer to the fundamental questions about how human beings should live together. But it was fundamentally incompatible with the American vision, which emphasized individual rights and personal freedom, and the idea that governments existed to serve citizens rather than the other way around. Henderson Field was where these two visions met in their most elemental form. Two groups of young men, armed with rifles and machine guns and grenades, killing each other in the darkness for possession of a strip of coral and dirt. But beneath the tactical battle was the philosophical one. Which vision of human organization was more powerful? Which could motivate men to fight more effectively? Which could produce better soldiers, more cohesive units, more effective military forces? The answer on that ridge had been clear. The American system, for all its messiness and informality and emphasis on individual rights, had produced soldiers who fought with extraordinary effectiveness. It had produced men like Mitchell Page, who combined technical skill with personal initiative and moral courage. It had produced a military culture that emphasized both individual responsibility and collective loyalty, that trusted junior leaders to make decisions, that encouraged adaptability and innovation rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. The Japanese system, for all its emphasis on spiritual strength and warrior tradition, had produced soldiers who were brave but inflexible, determined but unable to adapt when their initial assault failed. The Banzai charge, that tactical doctrine that was supposed to leverage Japanese spiritual superiority, had proven to be a meat grinder, a way of feeding young men into American machine gun fire for no tactical gain. Japanese officers, trained to value honor and glory over battlefield effectiveness, had ordered attack after attack, even when it was clear that the attacks were failing. They had sacrificed thousands of soldiers not because the sacrifices would lead to victory, but because the warrior code demanded attack, demanded forward movement, demanded death over retreat. As the morning wore on, American casualties were evacuated to field hospitals behind the lines. Mitchell Page's hands were treated, the burns and blisters bandaged, infection prevented with sulfa powder. He was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to understand exactly what had happened, how many Japanese soldiers had attacked, what weapons they had carried, what their tactics had been. Page answered their questions with the same methodical precision he had brought to firing his rifle. He didn't embellish. He didn't claim more than he had done. He simply described what had happened, hour by hour, moment by moment. The intelligence officers listened and took notes and exchanged glances. What Page was describing, a single Marine fighting essentially alone for critical minutes, holding off a force hundreds of times larger, seemed impossible, but the evidence was there on the ridge. The 300-plus Japanese bodies, the thousands of spent cartridge casings around Page's position, the testimony of other Marines who had watched him drag that machine gun into position and open fire. It had happened. One man in the right place at the right time with the right weapon and the right training and the right determination had changed the outcome of a major battle. This was the reality of modern warfare that the Japanese high command had failed to grasp. Technology mattered. Training mattered. Logistics mattered. All the spiritual strength in the world couldn't overcome machine gun fire. All the warrior tradition in the world couldn't defeat an enemy who had more ammunition, better weapons, and a military culture that emphasized practical effectiveness over symbolic gestures. The Japanese had come to Guadalcanal believing that their superior spirit would triumph. They left understanding that spirit, however important, couldn't substitute for material superiority and tactical flexibility. But Henderson Field taught lessons that went beyond the tactical and material. It taught lessons about human nature and courage and the different forms that dedication to duty could take. The Japanese soldiers who died on that ridge weren't cowards or fools. They were brave men fighting for what they believed in, following the code they had been taught since childhood. They had charged into machine gun fire, knowing they would probably die because their culture told them that glorious death in service to the emperor was the highest possible achievement. They were wrong about many things. Wrong about American weakness, wrong about the effectiveness of banzai charges, wrong about the war's likely outcome. But they weren't wrong about courage. They had courage in abundance. It simply wasn't enough. Mitchell Page had a different kind of courage. Not the courage of the glorious death, but the courage of the determined stand. Not the courage that came from accepting death as inevitable, but the courage that came from refusing to accept defeat. His courage wasn't performative or symbolic. It was practical and effective. He fought not because an ancient warrior code demanded it, but because his buddies were depending on him, because the mission required it, because walking away from that machine gun would have meant abandoning his responsibilities. This was democratic courage, not imposed from above by emperor or tradition, but chosen freely by an individual who understood what was at stake in the weeks after the battle. As the Marines continued to hold Henderson Field against repeated Japanese attacks, the story of Page's stand spread through the ranks. It was told in foxholes and aid stations, embellished and mythologized, turned into the kind of legend that soldiers tell each other to make sense of the chaos and horror of combat. Some of the details were probably exaggerated in the retelling. Maybe the number of Japanese dead was inflated. Maybe the duration of his single-handed stand was lengthened. But the core truth remained. One Marine with one machine gun had held a critical position when everything depended on it being held. That truth resonated through the Corps not because it was unique. Many Marines performed extraordinary acts of courage during the Guadalcanal campaign, but because it represented something essential about American military culture. You held your position, you didn't abandon your post, you did your job regardless of the cost. The Springfield rifle, meanwhile, continued its war. After Henderson Field, it would be carried by other Marines into other battles. It would fire tens of thousands of rounds. It would kill hundreds of enemy soldiers. It would eventually wear out, its barrel rifling smoothed by repeated firing, its action loosened by constant use. It might be rebuilt with new parts, might be modified and upgraded, might serve for years beyond that October night on Guadalcanal. Or it might be damaged beyond repair and scrapped, its component parts melted down and reused, its individual history lost in the great industrial machine of the American war effort. But for those hours in the darkness of October 24th, that particular Springfield, in the hands of that particular Marine, had been one of the most important weapons in the Pacific theater. Not because it was special or magical or blessed, because it was wielded with skill by a man who refused to give up, who understood that sometimes history pivots on individual actions, on personal decisions to stand or retreat, to fight or flee. Mitchell Page had chosen to stand. The Springfield had been his tool, Together, they had held the line the Japanese would never retake Henderson Field. They would continue to attack, would continue to sacrifice thousands of soldiers in increasingly desperate attempts to dislodge the Marines, but the October 24th assault represented their best chance. After that, it became a war of attrition, and attrition was a war that Japan, with its limited industrial capacity and overstretched supply lines, could not win. The Americans, with their vast industrial base and their ability to replace losses in men and equipment, could afford attrition. The Japanese could not. Henderson Field became a symbol of that strategic reality. The Americans had dug in and would not be dislodged. Years later, after the war ended, after Japan surrendered and the soldiers went home, historians and analysts would study the Guadalcanal campaign and identify it as the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan had been on the offensive, expanding their empire, seemingly unstoppable. After Guadalcanal, Japan was on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against American industrial and military might. The campaign lasted 6 months. More than 7,000 Americans were killed. More than 30,000 Japanese died. The fighting was savage, brutal, conducted in jungle conditions that weakened both sides with disease and exhaustion. But when it ended, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. America was winning. Mitchell Page's role in that turning point was, in the grand sweep of history, relatively small. He held one position for a few hours. He killed or wounded a few hundred enemy soldiers. In a war that would ultimately kill more than 60 million people worldwide, that was statistically insignificant. But warfare, for all the talk of grand strategy and industrial capacity and geopolitical forces, ultimately comes down to individual human beings making life and death decisions in moments of extreme stress. Page made the decision to stand and fight when many men would have retreated. His decision, multiplied across thousands of similar decisions made by American soldiers and Marines in the Pacific and European theaters, determined the war's outcome. The Springfield rifle became, in the retelling of Page's story, a symbol of American marksmanship and individual capability. It represented the frontier tradition of the rifleman, the idea that a skilled shooter with a good rifle could make a difference regardless of the odds. This was a peculiarly American myth, rooted in stories of backwoods sharpshooters defeating British regulars during the Revolution, of Western gunfighters settling disputes with superior speed and accuracy, of hunters providing for their families with precise shots at long range. The Springfield fit that mythic tradition. It was accurate, reliable, deadly in skilled hands. It required training and practice and dedication to master. It rewarded individual skill rather than volume of fire. The Japanese had their own military myths and traditions, but they were different. The samurai warrior, the bayonet charge, the glorious death in battle. These were collective actions, group efforts guided by ancient codes, and emperor worship. Individual marksmanship mattered less than group cohesion and spiritual unity. The Japanese military trained its soldiers to think of themselves as part of a greater whole, as instruments of imperial will. This produced soldiers who were incredibly brave and willing to sacrifice themselves without hesitation. But it also produced soldiers who struggled to adapt when their initial plans failed, who lacked the individual initiative that American military culture encouraged. Henderson Field exposed this cultural difference in its starkest form. The Japanese attacked in waves, following a predetermined plan, repeating tactics that had clearly failed because to do otherwise would have been to admit defeat and lose face. American forces, by contrast, adapted constantly. When a position was threatened, Marines like Page improvised solutions, dragging machine guns to new locations, redistributing ammunition, changing tactics based on what was actually happening rather than what the plan said should happen. This flexibility, this willingness to abandon the plan when the plan wasn't working, gave American forces a crucial advantage. It compensated for the fact that, in 1942, American forces were often outnumbered and outmatched by more experienced Japanese units. Superior adaptability made up for inferior numbers. The machine gun that Page used to such devastating effect represented American industrial capacity. The Browning M1917, though designed during World War I, remained one of the finest machine guns in the world in 1942. It was reliable, accurate, capable of sustained fire, and available in large numbers. The American military had machine guns to spare. They could afford to position them in overlapping fields of fire, to use them lavishly, to rely on firepower rather than manpower. The Japanese, by contrast, had to husband their machine guns carefully, use them sparingly, because their industrial base couldn't replace losses quickly. This material disparity, multiplied across every weapon system, every vehicle, every aircraft, would ultimately determine the war's outcome. Japan simply couldn't match American production. But in October 1942, on that ridge at Henderson Field, the outcome wasn't yet certain. The war was still balanced on a knife's edge. Individual battles still mattered. Individual acts of courage could still change the strategic situation. When dawn fully broke on October 24th, when the Japanese assault had been definitively repulsed and the immediate danger had passed, Mitchell Page stood and surveyed the battlefield. He saw the bodies of the men he had killed. Young men, most of them, no different from the Marines lying dead in their own foxholes. He saw the futility of it all, the waste of young lives on both sides. But he also saw that it had been necessary. The Japanese had come to conquer, to expand their empire, to impose their vision of Asian order on the Pacific. They had to be stopped. The bodies on that ridge, terrible as they were, represented the price of stopping them. The Springfield rifle, cleaned and oiled, would be returned to the armory. It would be issued to another Marine, would fire more rounds, would kill more enemy soldiers. Its individual history would be lost in the vast record-keeping apparatus of the American military, which tracked rifles by serial number, but cared little about the stories attached to those numbers. Decades later, collectors and historians would try to trace individual weapons, would search through records trying to determine which specific rifle had been at which battle. But the records were incomplete. The rifle might survive in a museum collection somewhere, its specific history unknown, or it might have been destroyed, scrapped, lost. It didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented: American capability, American determination, American willingness to stand and fight when everything depended on standing and fighting. The Japanese soldiers who survived the Henderson field assault would carry their trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Some would die in later battles, at Tarawa, or Saipan, or Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. Some would survive the war and return to a devastated Japan, would rebuild their lives in the ruins of their empire, would raise children and grandchildren who would grow up in a new Japan, a democratic Japan, a Japan remade in the American image. Those survivors would remember the night they charged up that ridge in the darkness, remember the machine gun fire that cut down their comrades, remember the moment they realized that the war was not going to end in Japanese victory. That realization, multiplied across thousands of Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific Theater, would slowly undermine Japanese morale, would spread the knowledge that America was not weak, that American firepower and determination were overwhelming Japanese spiritual strength and warrior tradition. Mitchell Page would survive the war. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Henderson Field, would become one of the Marine Corps' most decorated veterans, would spend the rest of his life telling the story of that night to anyone who would listen. He would never claim to be a hero. Heroes, he would say, were the men who died holding their positions, the men who never got to go home, the men whose names were carved on memorials and monuments. He had simply done his job. He had held the line because the line needed to be held. That was all. Nothing special. Just a Marine doing what Marines did. But it was special. It was heroic. Not because of superhuman courage or impossible odds, though both were present, but because it represented something fundamental about democracy and freedom and the American way of war. Page wasn't fighting for an emperor. He wasn't motivated by dreams of glorious death. He was fighting for his buddies, for the mission, for the principle that aggression had to be opposed, that empires built on conquest and subjugation had to be stopped. He was fighting, in his own inarticulate way, for the idea that human beings deserved to be free, that governments existed to serve citizens rather than exploit them, that the American democratic experiment, for all its flaws and failures, was worth defending. The Springfield rifle was the tool. Mitchell Page was the craftsman. Together on one night in October 1942, they held back an assault that could have changed the course of the Pacific War. They held a ridge on an obscure island that most Americans had never heard of before the war started. They held it not with superior numbers or overwhelming force, but with skill and determination and courage. They held it because losing was unacceptable, because retreat was not an option, because the war and everything it represented depended on men like Page doing exactly what he did. In the decades after the war, as the story of Henderson Field became part of Marine Corps legend, the focus would shift from individual weapons to individual courage. The Springfield would be mentioned only briefly, if at all. The machine gun would get more attention. It was, after all, the weapon that actually broke the Japanese assault. But both weapons were ultimately just tools. The real story was about the man who wielded them, about the culture that produced him, about the values and traditions and beliefs that made it possible for an ordinary American civilian to become an extraordinary warrior when circumstances demanded it. That was the lesson of Henderson Field. That was what Mitchell Page's stand represented. America didn't need to worship emperors or cultivate ancient warrior traditions to produce effective soldiers. American democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and personal freedom and horizontal loyalty, could produce men who fought just as effectively as any warrior culture. Perhaps more effectively because American soldiers brought flexibility and initiative and practical problem-solving to the battlefield. They didn't just follow orders blindly, they adapted, improvised, overcame obstacles through ingenuity rather than blind courage. The Japanese had believed that American materialism made Americans weak. They had believed that Americans, with their emphasis on comfort and prosperity, would collapse when faced with true hardship. Henderson Field proved them catastrophically wrong. Americans could endure hardship. Americans could face death without flinching. Americans could stand their ground and fight with a determination that matched anything Japanese warrior culture could produce. And Americans could do it while maintaining the individual initiative and adaptability that rigid military hierarchies tended to suppress. As the sun climbed higher over Guadalcanal on October 24th, burning off the morning mist, illuminating the scars of battle on that contested ridge, a new reality settled over the Pacific theater. Japan could not win this war. The myth of Japanese superiority, of spiritual strength triumphing over material weakness, lay shattered among the bodies. On that slope, America had demonstrated that its soldiers were the equal of any in the world, that American weapons and American tactics and American values produced military forces that Japan could not defeat. Mitchell Page, exhausted and wounded but alive, sat behind his ruined machine gun and understood none of this grand historical significance. He knew only that he had survived another day, that Henderson Field was still in Marine hands, that the war would continue. He cleaned his rifle, drank lukewarm water from his canteen, and waited for orders. There would be more fighting, more Japanese assaults, more desperate nights in foxholes. But the crucial moment had passed. The tide had turned. America was winning. The Springfield rifle, symbol of American marksmanship and individual capability, had played its part in that turning. Not the decisive part, that honor belonged to the machine gun and the man who wielded it, but an important part nonetheless. It represented tradition and skill and the idea that a good man with a good rifle could make a difference. That idea, peculiarly American in its emphasis on individual capability, had been tested at Henderson Field and proven true. One Marine with 2 weapons and unshakable determination had held off an assault that should have overwhelmed his position. He had done it not through spiritual superiority or warrior tradition, but through training and courage and the practical application of American military doctrine. That was enough. That was everything. The rifle would fight on in other hands in other battles. Mitchell Page would fight on, would survive the war, would carry the memory of that October night for the rest of his long life. Henderson Field would be held, would remain in American hands, would serve as the base from which American forces would launch the island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry them to Tokyo Bay. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, would consume millions more lives, would end only with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the outcome, after Henderson Field, was never really in doubt. America had proven it could fight. American soldiers had demonstrated that they were the equals of any warriors in the world. American industry would bury Japanese forces under an avalanche of tanks and planes and ships. American values, democracy, freedom, individual rights, would ultimately triumph over Japanese imperialism and its vision of Asian co-prosperity enforced at bayonet point. All of that hinged in small but significant ways on what happened on one ridge, on one island, on one October night in 1942. It hinged on ordinary American boys, turned into Marines through training and necessity, holding a line that had to be held. It hinged on men like Mitchell Page, who refused to retreat when retreat would have been rational, who stood and fought when every survival instinct screamed at them to run. It hinged on weapons like the Springfield rifle, old but effective, symbols of American tradition and capability. The sun rose fully now, bright and hot, beginning another day in the endless tropical summer. The jungle birds began to sing. The war continued. Henderson Field remained in American hands, a small strip of coral and dirt that represented everything America was fighting for: freedom, democracy, the right of people to govern themselves rather than submit to imperial conquest. One rifle, one Marine, one desperate stand in the darkness. That was how wars were won. That was how freedom was preserved. One position held, one assault repulsed. One impossible stand that changed everything.